This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning and welcome to Starting Point, everyone. I'm John Berman.
And good morning. I'm Brooke Baldwin. Soledad is off this week. We begin with the breaking news this morning. CNN has now confirmed the U.S. ambassador to Libya, the man you see here on the left side of your screen, is Christopher Stephens, and 3 other embassy staff. They are dead, killed in a rocket attack targeting the ambassador's car in Libya.
The group apparently on its way to a safer venue after protesters attacked the U.S. consulate in Benghazi and opened fire. The violence in protest to that amateur online film produced in the U.S. that offended millions and millions of Muslims. First, we want to bring in Elise Labott. She has known Ambassador Stephens for 10 years. She works at the State Department for us. Elise, this is a tragedy for the entire diplomatic community this morning.
Yes, yes. John, this is a terrible day for the State Department. I mean, everyone is going to be in mourning today, and it's not just the fact that Chris Stephens was such a popular figure at the State Department, really one of the cream of the crop of the U.S. Foreign Service, but it's been many years since someone of this level has been killed in an attack like this. So I think there's going to be a lot of shock waves through the State Department. I mean, after all the U.S. has done for the Libyans, using force to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, to help Libya stand up as it moved towards elections, as it tried to start anew, I think there's going to be a lot of gut-checking right now about how the U.S. wants to proceed, not just with Libya, but with a lot of countries in the Middle East. I mean, if you look at the Islamic wave that has swept the Middle East in terms of these revolutions, the U.S. was very apprehensive but said, we are going to support democratic movements. But they also said, Secretary Clinton has also said that an election does not a democracy make. And so if these countries are not going to necessarily hold up to their ends of the bargain, there are diplomatic conventions about protecting U.S. facilities, about holding to democratic values. And you saw some statements coming out of the Libyan Interior Ministry right now blaming the United States, in fact, for something like this. I think there's going to be a lot of, you know, the U.S. is really going to hunker down and think about how they want to proceed now, not just in Libya, but in the whole region.
Elise, this is Brooke. Let me just, as of course John points out, the diplomats really are certainly mourning this morning, and we're covering the story really as no way any other network can. I just want to ask here if we can just back up and if you can help us fill in the blanks as far as what exactly happened, because here we are, day 2 now of protests. We've been covering the protests both in Cairo and in Benghazi. We remember covering the revolution. That was really the rebel stronghold for so many months last year. Explain to us what exactly happened as far as this ambassador is concerned, and those 3 other workers who were apparently with him in his car.
Well, Brooke, details are very sketchy right now, but what we understand is we knew yesterday towards the end of the day that as we were watching those pictures of the embassy in Cairo, there were gunmen that had approached the U.S. consulate in Benghazi and breached the walls of the compound, and they were trying to secure the compound. Secretary Clinton put out a statement early this morning that 1 U.S. Foreign Service officer was killed. What we can, piecing together, and again, there hasn't been State Department confirmation of the details, is that they were trying to take Chris Stephens, the ambassador to Libya, who is based in Tripoli, I might add, and some other of the personnel out to safety, and there was a rocket attack, and they were killed.
Elise, it's John Berman here. You had mentioned before that these protesters were at the embassy in response to this movie about the Prophet Muhammad that has outraged millions of Muslims. The Libyan Deputy Interior Minister, Wanis al-Sharif, he told a group of reporters at a presser not long ago that they were there marching towards the U.S. consulate with their weapons to protest the U.S. stance and the fact that the U.S. did not stop that insulting movie. When the consulate security guards heard the gunfire, it seemed they felt the consulate was about to be attacked or under attack, so they started to fire from inside the consulate. This led to more anger from the crowd, et cetera, et cetera. Is that what you were talking about when you were saying the Libyans are almost seeming to blame the Americans at this point?
Exactly. I mean, I think that when something like this happens, instead of showing the remorse for what happened, and the U.S. was there trying to protect them, saying that the U.S. was responding to these armed protesters in a wrong way. Yes, it's the U.S. job to protect their facilities, but it's really the Libyans' job to protect their facilities. And if they thought that these armed gunmen were harmless or something like that, then they should have been the front lines of security at the embassy to push them back. So I'm not saying that the Libyans don't have a right, or perhaps understandably are upset about this type of movie. But we're talking about right now, Libya's trying to move towards democracy. And here in the United States, and there was a lot of talk about this yesterday, the U.S. supports freedom of the press, freedom of expression. These are some of the things that the U.S. has talked about when it talks about democracy, that everybody has a right to speak their mind, to express themselves, whether it's a movie, whether it's a protest, whether it's a cartoon, things like that. And they understand that you have to be sensitive in doing so. But to say that the U.S. did not respond to armed gunmen approaching the consulate in a wrong way and stoked anger, I think is going to raise a lot of eyebrows at the State Department, because this morning Secretary Clinton called, or last night, if you will, in Libya time, Secretary Clinton called the president of Libya and said, you better secure these facilities. That is your responsibility as the host government.
Elise Labott, do me a favor and stand by. We're going to keep coming back to you as this is all still developing here on this early morning. But I do want to bring in Peter Brooks. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a former CIA officer, currently a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Peter, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Let me just begin with, wow, you know, revolution. We thought revolutions had happened. We covered these revolutions, right, in both Libya and Egypt last year. And now we have this. I mean, in terms of diplomacy as we go forward, how does the U.S. proceed, and how do both Libya and Egypt proceed as well?
Very, very difficult. You know, while we're in this very important political season here in the United States, we can't forget about what's going on overseas. I mean, there's also Syria, which we're not talking about this morning. But,
yes.
but a lot of people thought that Libya perhaps was moving in the right direction, although there was concerns about armed militias, you know, the referendum, the Constitution, things along that line. And look at this terrible tragedy here, which seems to me, as I think about it, Brooke, is that it was a plot. You know, they not only attacked the embassy, but then they had somebody laying in wait with an RPG to attack the ambassador's car. So it's more than just a crowd going after the embassy protesting of internet film. So, I mean, this is very, very troubling. And Egypt, you know, there were 100 American businessmen there on a trade mission this week. The American State Department has talked about dismissing $1 billion in Egyptian debt. And I've not heard much. Now, I'm here at CNN, but I haven't heard all of the news this morning. But I haven't seen a strong statement coming out of the President Morsi of Egypt about this issue. And where are the security forces in these countries? That I want to see mugshots of these people that were involved in this, you know, especially the attack on the ambassador. So very, very important things that we have to be thinking about.
And specifically, you mentioned Mohammed Morsi. We know, of course, backed by Muslim Brotherhood, as you point out, you know, making very much so efforts to communicate, to keep those very, very strong ties with the West and specifically the U.S. So far, no statement from him. You know, hearing from an Egyptian blogger last night on our air, he basically, you know, she said he's MIA.
Right.
What do we need to hear from Mohammed Morsi?
He's got to condemn the violence, and he's also got to say that he's going to track down these perpetrators and bring them to justice. That's what we need to see. But if I can channel Morsi for a moment, he's very concerned because the groups that were probably involved in this attack in Cairo are probably, you know, more radical than the Muslim Brotherhood. And he's very cautious about walking this fine line between the secularists and the radicals, which is not easy at all for him. It's not easy at all for him to do because he is a new president. But he's got to do the right thing. I think in the past we've seen them go after radicals and violent extremists in the Sinai. He's got to do the right things here, and those security forces need to bring these people to justice, not only in Cairo, but obviously in Libya as well.
On the phone joining us now, thank you, Peter, is former Syrian Ambassador Theodore Katouf. Mr. Stephens, Chris Stephens worked for Katouf when Katouf was ambassador to Syria, and talked to us this morning about the Chris Stephens, the man who was in Libya, the man who said he was thriving there, so enjoying being part of this change happening all over the Arab world.
Chris Stephens was one of the most brave and infectiously enthusiastic people I've known in the Foreign Service. I just awakened this morning to the news, and I can't tell you how shocked and saddened I am. He was a great Foreign Service officer. He was incredibly positive. He took on all the tough assignments. And there is a saying, it's a rather cynical one, that no good deed goes unpunished. And Chris Stephens did great deeds for the Libyan people and for this country during the Libyan uprising. And it's just and ironically tragic that of all the people, he was killed over some film that most Americans have never even heard about.
Ambassador Katouf, ambassador to Syria in 2002, 2003. Let me read you a statement that we found this morning that was on the U.S. Embassy website. It's a haunting statement now about Chris Stephens and his time in Libya. He said, Ambassador Chris Stephens considers himself fortunate to participate in this incredible period of change and hope for Libya. As the president's representative, his job is to develop a strong, mutually beneficial relationship between the United States and Libya. Ambassador Stephens was the American representative to the Transitional National Council in Benghazi, of course, during the revolution. That statement, it really is haunting at this point, Ambassador.
It is. I met with Ambassador Stephens just before he went out to assume his new duties as ambassador. I had a nonprofit that does education, training, exchange programs. We teach English. And he was so enthusiastic about wanting to have my organization out there on the ground, working with the Libyan people, et cetera. You know, a lot of ambassadors would have blown off that kind of soft power diplomacy, but Chris understood the importance of it. He served all over the region. And as Elise Lavitt indicated, people loved this guy. He was just, he was very special. And I suspect that I would like to think that senior Libyan officials this morning are ashamed of what's happened.
Ambassador Katouf, thank you so very much. We are sorry for your loss. The entire diplomatic community this morning feeling the loss of Chris Stephens, very, very popular around the world.
People loved Ambassador Stephens. Ambassador Stephens, it sounds like, loved Libya. I want to go to Jomana Karadsha. She's on the phone with us live from Tripoli. And Jomana, just do me a favor. Tell me what you know has thus far happened and what's happening here today on this early morning.
Well, Brooke, we have not received any information from the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli here. They are being very tight-lipped about what happened and not even confirming or denying these reports that it was indeed Ambassador Chris Stephens who was killed in this attack. But according to Libyan officials, the consulate was attacked by militants yesterday. We had eyewitnesses on the ground who described the situation there as a front line, fierce clashes that took place for hours with rocket-propelled grenades fired at the consulate. There are conflicting reports on how the fatality did occur, how Ambassador Stephens may have been killed. There are reports that it was from the RPG attack, and there are other reports that he suffocated from the fire that was in the, with the embassy, the consulate building being torched. Now we're expecting to hear more from Libyan officials. A press conference here is going to start momentarily, held by Libya's two top officials, the Prime Minister and the Speaker of Parliament. All Libyan officials we have spoken to today, and Libyans on the street here in Tripoli are shocked by this attack, condemning this attack, and they see Ambassador Stephens and the United States as friends of Libya, and they're truly ashamed by what happened.
Jomana, just so I'm clear, as we were reporting yesterday, and as you've been reporting this morning, there were the protests at the U.S. Consulate there in Benghazi, and that is where one worker was killed. And then we learn of the death of Ambassador Stephens. And as far as a timeline, that is still unclear, correct? Because according to our reporting, according to your sources, he was targeted with 3 other workers in a car, and we don't know as far as the timeline of that death and the protest, correct?
That is the case, Brooke. It has been very difficult to get any clarity on what actually happened, the timeline, because the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy here have revealed very little information.
Jomana, it's John Berman here, and I have a question because this may be confusing for a lot of Americans waking up this morning to hear that the U.S. ambassador was killed in Libya after last October Muammar Gaddafi was killed in Libya after the U.S. seemed to support the uprising there. What has been the sentiment towards the U.S. over the last several months? Is there a rising anti-American sentiment there? We appear to have lost Jumana in Libya right now, but we are fortunate that we're joined right now by Jamie Rubin, of course, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. Jamie's with us here in New York this morning. And that question I asked to Jumana, I can ask to you. This will be confusing to a lot of Americans when we hear that a U.S. diplomat was killed in Libya. Libya is supposed to be this place where change is happening for the good, presumably.
Yes, and I think that there has not been a big rise in anti-American sentiment in Libya in recent months. There are still a lot of internal problems in Libya. Libya is hardly a stable society. But I think when your reporter said that there's a lot of shame inside in Tripoli amongst the people, amongst the government there, the fact they're pulling out their two highest-ranking political officials to talk about this today, I expect to see the kind of expressions of regret and shame and all of the signs and sentiments we would hope to come from Libya will be in this press conference coming in the coming hours out of Libya. And it is tricky to understand the connection between this attack and the broader protests against the United States in Cairo and in the region and in Libya specifically. And I think it's very important until we know whether the death of the U.S. ambassador was a result of the protests and he was killed escaping the consulate. It may have been a separate plot of some kind where his car was targeted by a group that was an anti-American, al-Qaeda-affiliated extremist Islamic group, or it may be this whole thing spun out of control as a result of a firefight beginning at the consulate. So until you are able to answer that question, it's kind of hard to assign the significance of this.
That's why I was trying to ask about the timeline, and I think that'll be fleshed out over time. As you mentioned, top Libyan officials will be speaking, and I'm sure we'll bring that in here to CNN. As far as who's not really speaking yet, and having worked at the State Department, if you can, Jamie, and just lift the veil, I mean, what are the machinations happening within the State Department now? When will they confirm?
I expect fairly soon. There are probably, a lot of notifications to be made. There's, obviously the ambassador himself, but his staff. Each of the individuals, they have families who are, if they know their son or daughter is in Libya right now, who are obviously frantic. So I expect what's going on is that there's a lot of tracking down of family members of the three staffers plus the ambassador, notifications, discussions, plans for what to do with the bodies, which are apparently not yet in U.S. custody. And then once that is done, the internal steps to make sure that family members are notified, not from the media, then I expect they'll be able to give us these factual questions. I would expect a full briefing from the State Department fairly soon.
The White House, of course, hasn't given us official confirmation yet, but they have told us that President Obama is being kept abreast of the situation in Libya by his National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, at this moment. So the White House on top of this, as we know.
I'm sure, as you point out, we'll be hearing from the State Department, of course, publicly from the White House as well. Fluid situation. Jamie Rubin, stay with us because we need to get a quick commercial break in, but we're going to stay on this breaking news coverage all morning long here again. The U.S. ambassador to Libya and 3 other embassy staffers killed in a rocket attack overnight in Benghazi. We are going to talk to former House Speaker Newt Gingrich next. Starting Point, back in a moment.